child. Good morning. How you doing? Ooh, I've been promoted to novice. It's gonna be good. I think I can. It's slow to get pilot marks. I hate that. Too slow. Situation.
Or else they will sweep over the United States and take what we have. He is, unfortunately, representing a substantial, probably dominant body of American opinion. To us today, it may seem difficult to understand how it could be seriously believed 30 years ago that a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy was threatening the survival of Germany, the bearer of the spiritual value of Western civilization. 59 To others today, it may be equally difficult to take seriously the picture of the strongest, richest nation on earth cowering in terror behind its missiles and new 249 American power and the Innumander RINS. Clear warheads, in fear that what we have will be taken away if we allow a tiny country halfway around the world to follow its own course in freedom from American domination. Nevertheless, this characterization is no caricature. People in the so-called peace movement have a tendency to regard Lyndon Johnson as an illegitimate usurper who does not represent the mainstream of American opinion. They are probably deluding themselves. Statements such as those just quoted may very well reflect prevailing American attitudes, and one who wishes to think realistically about the American imperial role would do well to bear this in mind, as he should bear in mind the fact that this is a country in which a leading liberal commentator, after all that has happened in the past 3 years, can describe the American war in Vietnam in these terms. America is fighting a war now on the principle that military power shall not compel South Vietnam to do what it does not want to do, that man does not belong to the state. This is the deepest conviction of Western civilization, and rests on the old doctrine that the individual belongs not to the state but to his creator, and therefore has inalienable rights as a person, which no magistrate or political force may violate. 60. As I have just pointed out, we are not the first nation to have seen itself as fighting to defend the deepest convictions of Western civilization. When James Reston, with the access to information that he has, can seriously contend that we have been fighting to preserve the inalienable rights of the people of Vietnam against military power or political force, we can see what a long road lies ahead before there is any hope that this country will recover its political sanity. The colonialist mentality that colors the American perception of the Vietnam War is strikingly evident in the reactions of those who are turning against the war as its monstrous character. 250. The logic of withdrawal becomes too plain to hide. Several months ago, for example, the top leaders of the International Voluntary Services resigned, some after almost a decade of work in Vietnamese villages, because they believed that our military action was proving counterproductive and threatened to alienate the majority of the Vietnamese from their American savior. 61. The IVS group paints a grim picture of the consequences of our military intervention in Vietnam, in terms that are not unfamiliar to readers of the American press. Their resignation was intended as a protest against policies which, they predict, can only serve to drive still more of the population into association with the NLF. They assert that our commitment in Vietnam has always been to one element of Vietnamese society, the urban educated group, which has felt that a non-communist, independent government would best serve their interests and the interests of their compatriots in the rural villages of South Vietnam. That we had a right to make such a commitment and to act on it is not questioned in their statement. The tragedy unfolding in Vietnam to which Senator Morton refers is that we were unable to realize this commitment, to construct a stable government that would represent the interests of the Vietnamese, as these interests are interpreted by the urban educated group. No one would question the sincerity or dedication of the IVS leaders, or their undoubted contributions in their work in South Vietnam. But there is every reason to question their assumption that we have the right to restructure and organize South Vietnamese society by force if necessary. Their resignation came in the fall of 1967, along lines that we have set. In essence, their position is not different from that of Lord Cornwallis, whose permanent settlement in India in 1793 restructured village society, creating a landed aristocracy on the British pattern. 25.1. American power and the Enumanda RINS. There is no reason to doubt the sincerity of his belief that this civilized arrangement could only benefit the Indians in the long run. Of course, the new Squire Archie also happened to serve British interests, as the British Governor-General Lord William Bentinck put it. If security was wanting against popular tumult or revolution, I should say that the permanent settlement has this great advantage of having created a vast body of rich landed proprietors deeply interested in the continuance of British dominion and having complete command over the mass of the people. 1829. Our reasons for wanting to control Vietnam are not those of the British in India in 1829, but in Vietnam, as in the Philippines and Latin America, our efforts are directed to organizing, restructuring the society so as to ensure the domination of those elements that will enter into partnership with us. That we should do so is not surprising, surely not to anyone who is familiar with the history of imperialism. What is extraordinary is that at this late date we should act with so little awareness of what we are doing, that we still find it possible to deceive ourselves, though few others. 62. With the classical rhetoric of long middle-decade imperialism. Before continuing with this sketch of American reactions to the war in Vietnam, I would like to cite another American military source, which gives much insight into the nature of the Viet Cong's success in the face of the titanic military force with which we have attempted to batter it to the ground. The success of this unique system of war depends upon almost complete unity of action of the entire native population. That such unity is a fact is too obvious to admit of discussion. How it is brought about and maintained is not so plain. Intimidation has undoubtedly accomplished much to this end, but fear as the only motive is hardly sufficient to account for the united and apparently spontaneous action of several millions of people. 1 Drayton. 252. The logic of withdrawal. In each town would effectually destroy such a complex organization. This assessment is from the United States War Department report, In the year 1900, the author is Major General Arthur MacArthur, and he is commenting, of course, on the campaign to suppress the Philippine War of National Liberation, then actively in progress. These remarks are perfectly apropos today. I quote them to dispel the thought that Vietnam is merely a unique aberration, a blunder, merely a result of the politics of inadvertence, without roots in our history and without significance for the future. There is, of course, a sense in which the liberal critics are correct when they refer to the Vietnam War as an aberration. In Vietnam, we lost control. The Vietnamese refused to play the game the way they were expected to when the war was simulated on the Rand Corporation computers. They did not realize that they were supposed to yield when the pressure reached a certain point. Therefore, we were forced to escalate beyond any reasonable level, to a stage where our economy and society can hardly bear the cost. In this respect, it is true, Vietnam is an aberration. In all other respects, it is a natural consequence of the policy that was described 3/4 of a century ago by Brooks Adams, in prophetic words, when he proclaimed, "Our geographical position, our wealth, and our energy preeminently fit us to enter upon the development of Eastern Asia and to reduce it to part of our economic system." The suppression of the movement for Philippine independence, shortly after, was only the first attempt to put into practice the policy of reducing Eastern Asia to part of our economic system. At that time, we were defending Christianity from the savage Moors. Now, we are defending the free world from the international communist conspiracy. In other 25 J. Emory, California, when power NDTHENU MANRINS. Respects, little has changed, except for the scale of our attack. Again, the example of the Philippine War illustrates the need to turn our attention from the problems of Southeast Asia to those of the United States, to the ideological commitments on which American initiatives are based, and the national self-image that permits them to be tolerated with such equanimity, in particular, the unshakable belief in American goodwill and generosity that persisted through each calamity, notably among the self-styled hard-headed and pragmatic liberals, and that stultifies political thinking and debases political discourse. We can, for example, learn a great deal about the sources of American Vietnamese policy by observing how American scholarship comes to terms with the suppression of the Philippine struggle for independence, in which, incidentally, there were well over 1,000 Filipino casualties. Thus Louis Paley argued that we could not hand the Philippines back to the Spanish tyranny, and they were in no condition to govern themselves or income past their own defense. If we simply got out and came home, we would leave chaos behind, with the Germans and Japanese lurking in wait. Therefore, the United States, having inadvertently become responsible for the Philippines, had no alternative to assuming itself the obligation of governing and defending what consequently became the first item of an American overseas empire. 63. It need hardly be pointed out that it was the American expeditionary force from whom the Filipinos needed defense. Nor will I discuss the kind of society that we bequeathed them, 64, except to remark that for reasons that are perhaps obvious, the Huk guerrillas once again appear to be in control of large areas of central Luzon, setting the stage for what may be a bloody reenactment of the tragedy of Vietnam. We can also learn a good deal from the reactions of America 1/54. The logic of withdrawal. Observers, the tensions that have developed between the United States and the Philippines in the post-war period. Consider, for example, the remarks of David Sternberg, 65, who asks what has happened to the Philippine reservoir of goodwill and friendship toward Americans since formal independence was granted to our Philippine colony. To this long middle-term resident of the Philippines and former aid advisor, It appears that there were few complex problems under the American occupation, once the scars of war had healed and America's good intentions had gained credence, and the mass of Filipinos were able to relate the realization of their personal hopes and aspirations to a benign American presence. But now, the commercial American, though still benign employer, is also a potential competitor. The old, mutually satisfactory mentor-student relation, suffused by the warmth of the benign employer to his wards, is difficult to reconstruct under the conditions of former independence. Of course, there is hope. For example, in the cultural predisposition toward private enterprise and the existence of a small but highly competent body of planners and managers at the top level of the private economic sector. The hope is not dimmed by the fact that 70 years after the benign American presence was established by force, 3/4 of the population live under conditions unchanged since the Spanish occupation, under the continuing rule of a political and economic elite who were coopted into the colonial regime and have an affectionate respect for the American way of life. 66 The respect not unrelated, perhaps, to the great privileges that they enjoy as a consequence of the American conquest. 67 It is remarkable to see how easily perceptive and informed commentators succeed in deluding themselves as to the character of American actions and policies. For example, Roger Hill's 2511, American Power and the Inhuman RINS. Mann, in his recently published study of policy making under the Kennedy administration to move a nation, discusses the attempt to concentrate the peasantry in strategic hamlets in the early 1960s, maintaining that the primary role of the strategic hamlet was to provide the peasants a free choice between the Viet Cong and the government. As he makes very clear, this free choice was to be provided by careful police work inside the hamlets, for it seemed obvious that putting up defenses around a village would do no good if the defenses enclosed Viet Cong agents. The failure of the program he attributes to the fact that there had been no real effort to isolate the population from the Viet Cong by eliminating Viet Cong agents and supporters inside the strategic hamlets and by imposing controls on the movement of people and supplies. Viet Cong supporters and agents had no difficulty recontracting the hamlet and continuing subversion. Thus the program failed to provide the villager with physical security, so that he has a choice of refusing to cooperate with the Viet Cong, a free choice which is obviously denied him as long as Viet Cong supporters are permitted to exist in his village. There is no doubt an important difference between this level of self-deception and that of Marshall Key, who describes the philosophy of his government as 100% social revolutionary. 68 Or CIA analyst George Carver, who tells us of the genuine social revolution now taking place in the urban areas of South Vietnam. 69 The natural reaction to such pronouncements is one of ridicule, but amusement phrase when one begins to calculate the human cost. Let us return to Howard's in study, cf. Note 1. In the light of some of these general observations, Zinn has some apt remarks about the moral blindness that permits America to remain insensitive to the agony of Vietnam. We listen with their 256. The logic of withdrawal. Languor of a people who have never been bombed, who have only been the bombardiers. We have no Hiroshima, no city of the blind and maimed, no professors haggard from long terms in jail. We have never been forced to recognize our deeds, to bow, to apologize, to promise a life of peace. We have, in other words, never been called. Thus protest is mooted and diffused, as Uncle Sam, the white-gloved financier of counter-revolution, has removed his gloves, taken gun in hand, and moved into the jungle, and has slowly composed an enormous pattern of devastation which, if seen in its entirety, would have to be described as one of the most evil acts committed by any nation in modern times. There are, I think, certain gaps in Zinn's analysis of the factors that prevent withdrawal of what can only be described as our army of occupation. Consider the matter of prestige. Zinn disposes effectively of the claim that our prestige as a nation would be diminished by withdrawal, noting that this would satisfy a range of opinion that extends from Mad Anna to the Japanese left. But there is also the matter of internal prestige, the factor to which Eric Hobsbawm referred when he pointed out that American policy making often seems less concerned with red areas on the map than with red faces in the Pentagon. Furthermore, it may be that in some respects Zinn underestimates the subtlety of those whose arguments he counters. For example, he remarks that we see every rebellion as the result of some plot concocted in Moscow or Peking, and that the Russians make the same mistake, attributing revolts in Hungary or Poznan to bourgeois influence or to American scheming. Although one can, to be sure, become a prisoner of one's own propaganda, it is nevertheless difficult to believe that the Russian leaders so misunderstood the events of 1956. More. 257. American power and the Innumander are RNS. Likely, they were unwilling to tolerate an erosion of their power in a sensitive area and found in bourgeois influence and American scheming a useful propaganda cover. Similarly, it strains credulity to suppose that our present Secretary of State was simply deluded when he described the Paping regime in 1951 as a colonial Russian government, a Slavic Manchukuo on a larger scale. Ample evidence was available to him to show the absurdity of this evaluation. For example, in the State Department white paper on China published not long before. More likely, as in the case of the Hungarian Revolution, it was necessary to find a way to justify a variety of long middle-range missiles, strengthening the Western Alliance and rearming Germany, expanding the nuclear arsenal, stemming popular revolutions in the Third World and subverting or strangling those that had taken place. Similarly, it is not easy to convince oneself that the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, really believed that Mossadegh was willfully creating a communist state, or that Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs Thomas Mann was so woefully ignorant of world affairs as to suppose that the Dominican Revolution in 1965 resulted from the machinations of a Sino-Soviet military bloc. Rather, one must adapt to current styles of acceptable international behavior. It would not do to use today the phraseology of Secretary of State Philander Knox, who sent Marines into Cuba in 1908, saying that the United States does not undertake first to consult the Cuban government if a crisis arises requiring a temporary landing somewhere. And in general, the international communist conspiracy is a perfect propaganda device to justify actions that reinforce and extend American hegemony, serving our aims just as bourgeois influence and American scheming serve those of Russian imperialism. In both cases, there is, of course, a background of fact that. 258. The logic of withdrawal gives a superficial plausibility to the fabrications of the propaganda. Similarly, I think that Zinn does not go far enough in analyzing the justification for the war given by the dissatisfied liberals, a very important matter if one hopes to construct a domestic political base for a policy of disengagement in Vietnam, or more generally, for a significant reorientation of American international behavior away from the policy of repression and restructuring on American terms, disguised as anti-communism and preservation of order. I have already given a number of illustrations of the ideological blinders that must be removed before sensible discussion can even begin. Others can easily be added. Consider, for example, Richard Goodwin's essay, cited in Note 47. Goodwin constructs a powerful argument against the war, but concludes nevertheless that the war is ultimately justified in part on grounds of American self-interest, in part because of the necessity for protecting Asia from dominion or conquest by a hostile power. As to the first, the bedrock vital interest of the United States, which must serve as the single standard against which any step in policy making must be tested, is to establish that American military power, once committed to defend another nation, cannot be driven from the field even if, as in the case in question, an American withdrawal would be in the face of an enemy that is largely indigenous. Tempting if we generalize this bedrock vital interest to other great powers, the outlook for the future is dim. The Soviet Union, for example, could have used this argument to justify its military intervention in Hungary, in support of what it regarded as the legitimate government, against rebels incited from the outside and including fascist elements, etc. Order 259. American power and the enemy Mander RINF maintain its missiles in Cuba that to defend against American invasion, in which case we would not now be discussing Vietnam or anything else. Still more interesting, however, is the second argument, that we must protect Asia from dominion or conquest by a hostile power. I will not dwell on the fact that all reputable authorities agree that the Vietnamese are strongly anti-Chinese, 71, so that if we were really interested in containing Chinese expansionism, we should presumably be supporting Ho Chi Minh, along with all popular, indigenous forces on the border of China, whatever their domestic character. What seems to me most revealing, however, is the reason that Goodwin cites as underlying our commitment to protect Asia from outside force. It is the almost idealistic, compelling conviction that the one nation with the power to prevent it should not stand aside while nations unwillingly submit to foreign domination. Thus we must not endure the central world purpose of the United States, the creation of an international order of independent states. It does not occur to him that by suppressing a victorious insurrection, we are precisely undermining the central world purpose and forcing a nation to submit to foreign domination. Nor does he take note of the fact that we are unable to form a puppet government with even the legitimacy of those set up by Germany and Japan. We have not, for example, been able to find a national figure of the stature of Tain or Wang Ching Wai to mask our aggression. This sentimental faith in American benevolence, with its various corollaries, the politics of inadvertence, the inscrutability of history, is a major factor that stands in the way of the realistic and common-sense proposal that Zinn advocates. Zinn's discussion of the Munich analogy could also be used fully extended by a consideration of the views of the Kennedy. 260. The logic of withdrawal. Liberals. Goodwin, for example, is too sophisticated to accept the Munich analogy, but he goes on to offer a revealing counterthesis. He argues, first of all, that in Vietnam we are combating not aggression but internal aggression, an interesting phrase, which refers apparently to aggression by a revolutionary movement against a government maintained in power by foreign arms. And he concludes that what we face is not Munich but rather another episode in a long, continuing conflict. Other episodes include our success in Greece and Turkey, Soviet intervention in Cuba, the invasion of Korea, the bombing of Camon and Matsu, subversion in the Congo and Central African Republic, fighting in Malaya and the Philippines and on the Indian border. And now, he adds, they are beginning in Thailand. But with whom are we engaged in this long, continuing conflict? Certainly not the Soviet Union, which had little to do with the Sino-Indian border dispute, nor China, which did not start the civil war in Greece, nor Ho Chi Minh, who, for all his sins, is not responsible for subversion in the Congo. Nor is international communism a very convincing devil in the wake of the Sino-Soviet split. gestures of independence in Eastern Europe and North Korea, the admitted refusal of North Vietnam, even in its present desperate straits, to kowtow to its powerful allies. In fact, there is no identifiable adversary. We are confronted with a mysterious but dangerous force, which cannot be located or specified in any concrete term, but which is there, threatening us. While rejecting the Munich analogy, Goodwin, the liberal critic, tacitly accepts the assumption on which it is based and which gives it great plausibility. For if this force exists, then surely we must stop it in Vietnam before it lands on the beaches of Florida or Cape Cod. The unpleasant fact is that if one wishes to pursue the 26th one, American power and the Innumander are Ryanets. Munich analogy, there is only one plausible contender for the role of Hitler. And if China or Russia do involve themselves in World War III over Vietnam, we can be sure that the memory of Munich will play an important role in their calculations. 72 Arnold Toynbee has put the matter quite succinctly. The President manifestly feels that he is speaking with Churchill's voice, the Churchill of 1940, but to the ears of peoples who have suffered from Western domination in the past. His voice sounds like the Kaiser's and like Hitler's. There is surely no greater irony than the demand that to ensure world peace, the United States must develop a strategy from the containment of China. China is surrounded by American missiles and huge military bases supporting an army 8,000 miles from home. It is subject to regular bombardment from an island that is barely off the mainland, not to speak of overflights and commando raids, all under the protection of the 7th Fleet, admittedly intervening in a civil war. For 2 years, American planes have been bombing the only railroad connecting southwestern China, with its industrial center of Kunming, to the rest of the country. It happens to pass near Hanoi. Yet even a Roger Hilsman, one of the sanest voices commenting on Asian affairs, can speak of the formidable threat posed by Communist China, and can conclude that it certainly served no useful purpose for the United States to reward aggression by recognizing Communist China war by encouraging their being seated in the UN 78. It is illuminating to examine in detail Hilsman's demonstration of Chinese belligerence. The primary example of China's aggression, apart from aggression in Korea, is the support for the crude and unsophisticated insurrections in Burma, Thailand, Malaya, the Philippines, and French Indochina, which the Chinese succeeded in putting on the more. 262. The logic of withdrawal. Effective, politically sophisticated course, p. 285. The history of Chinese belligerence, of the aggression which we must be careful not to reward, is completed with these instances. 1. The cancellation of trade contacts with Japan when the Vichy government would not allow the Chinese flag to be flown over its mission in Tokyo. 2. Various unrealized threats to Hong Kong, including an appeal to nationalist leaders to make a deal. 3. The suppression of the Tibetan revolt. 4. The Sino-Indian border crisis. 5. Encouraging the local communists in a direct use of military force, first in Laos and then in South Vietnam. p. 288f. It is not easy to decide which of these is the most telling example of Chinese aggression, perhaps Burma, in which, according to U Thant in 1965, there has not been a single instance of outside help to the Burmese communists during a period when Chinese nationalist forces roamed northern Burma at great cost to the Burmese. It would also be interesting to discover what evidence was available to the Director of Intelligence for the State Department regarding Chinese control, or even material assistance, in the cases of Thailand, Malaya, and the Philippines, and also to discover why this evidence has never been made public. Chinese aggression in Indochina, in contrast to the responsible and purely defensive posture of the Western powers, is of course well documented. As to Laos, Hillsman himself repeats much of the well-known story of the American attempt to subvert the legitimate government, replicating it by pro-Western neutralists and then a right-wing military dictatorship, an attempt which continued until 1962, when Kennedy, in a dramatic and sensible reversal of policy, agreed finally to support the neutralist elements that had previously been backed only by the communist powers. Quite revealing in this connection is Hillsman's judgment that the real communists. 283. American power and the Enumanda RINS. Threat in Laos seems more likely to have been an expansion of political control based on winning peasant support in the villages. P. 112 threat rather like that posed by the 1954 Geneva Agreements, which the Viet Minh thought would give them half of Vietnam for sure and an excellent opportunity to win the other half through political subversion, that is, an electoral victory. P. 103. Hillsman also has relevant comments on the Sino-Indian border dispute. He observes, p. 322, that the Indians unwisely provided the Chinese ample provocation by adopting a forward strategy, establishing isolated outposts behind the Chinese outposts that India felt had encroached on what they considered their rightful territory, and Prime Minister Nehru, in the early fall of 1962, announced publicly that the Indian army had been ordered to clear India's territory of the Chinese aggressors. He points out that the unilateral Chinese pullback of their victorious armies showed that we face not only a powerful enemy but a politically skillful one. P. 33-8. He does not, unfortunately, go into the background of the conflict, but excellent Western sources exist that thoroughly refute the simplistic view advanced, to my knowledge, by not a single Western scholar, that the border dispute was merely, or even primarily, a matter of Chinese aggression. The issue of Tibet we need not discuss, since whatever the facts may be and if Western scholarship is to be trusted, they are not simply what is claimed by American propaganda. Tibet is internationally recognized as a region of China. One might with equal logic accuse the United States of aggression in war, or in the Mississippi Delta, where, reports indicate, thousands are starving while Washington plays politics. Elsewhere, Hillsman demonstrates Chinese aggressiveness on the basis of the principle of post hoc ergo propter hoc. 264. The logic of withdrawal. It was in November 1957, following the Soviet Sputnik success, that Mao proclaimed that the east wind prevails over the west wind, and so heralded the shift from the Bandung policy of peaceful coexistence back to a hard line. In South Vietnam, incidents of guerrilla terrorism and assassination began to mount. P. 418-19. The same claim is made in connection with his discussion of the difficulties faced by the pro-Western neutralist Phui Sanami Kon, who came to power through American intrigue in Laos. Phui and his policy also had the misfortune to come to the test just when communist policy was changing away from the peaceful coexistence of the Bandung spirit to the hard line enunciated by Mao Zedong in his East Wind over West Wind speech in Moscow in November 1957. It was during the next year that Hanoi, following this new hard line, reached the decision to begin the guerrilla war against the South. P. 119. The suggestion that it was the Chinese hard line that was responsible for the failure of the American policy of subversion in Laos is a most interesting one. According to the American reporter Arthur Doman, who appears to be Hillsman's primary source of information on Laos, The Chinese took no action at all in Laos until the end of 1959, despite American violations of the Geneva Agreements by the supplying of arms and military training by American officers in civilian clothes. 74, and after that their interference consisted of offering support for the neutralist Suvarnabhumi government that the United States was trying desperately to replace, first by the pro-Western neutralist FUI and then by the outright fascist FUMINO of ANF. However, this is not the point. To Hilsman, the aggressiveness of China and Russia is demonstrated by the fact that they supported the neutralist Suvarnabhumi against the American. 265. American Power and the New Mandarin. Sponsored attempt to overthrow his government through continual and intensive subversion. As to the claim that Hanoi decided to begin guerrilla war in the south on the basis of Mao Zedong's New Hard Line, Hilsman makes no attempt to substantiate this allegation, which is in conflict with whatever is known of the historical record. 75. Hilsman, recall, was Director of Intelligence for the State Department and then Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs. He is a Kennedy liberal and an academic expert on international affairs. His treatment of historical events and the reasoning on which he bases conclusions about such matters as Chinese aggressiveness can only be described as appalling, yet it represents the best and most sophisticated thinking that is to be found near the center of power, so the available information indicates. One cannot escape a feeling of alarm on reading Hilsman's study of how policy was set in the Kennedy administration. In discussing Chinese aggressiveness, we must bear in mind that there is a clear sense in which China has already shown itself to be very aggressive, namely, the following. We must recognize that an overt act of war has been committed by an enemy when that enemy builds a military force intended for our eventual destruction, and that the destruction of that force before it can be launched or employed is defensive action and not aggression. As a nation we must understand that an overt act of war has been committed long before the delivery of that first blow. 76. One wonders how long it will be before the American Air Force undertakes defensive action against such overt acts of war on the part of the Chinese. It would be wrong to leave this matter of American containment of China without reference to a few simple facts that 286. The logic of withdrawal rarely seemed to penetrate the American consciousness. There is something peculiarly ugly about the American reaction to the attempt of China to achieve national unity, to raise itself from penury and starvation, to erase a century of degradation. K.S. Carroll 77 puts the matter plainly, in words that Americans would do well to ponder. By trying to strangle China, which has been permanently on the edge of famine, and by threatening her with bombs, America has helped to harden the Chinese and make them what they are today. The American anti-Chinese propaganda boomerangs on the people. Pharisaic editorial writers like Joseph Alsop and others periodically announce with contemptible pleasure Chinese famines which exist, fortunately, only in their imaginations, but their editorials are often read in countries with pro-American governments where famine actually rages. Sooner or later truth will out, and it is then doubly unfavorable to the Americans. First, because it is disgusting to see the world's most overfed country rejoicing that others, even if they are communist, are suffering from hunger. And secondly, because one discovers that it is not in China but in their own camp in Central or South America, for example, that people are dying of malnutrition. Today a Kwangtung peasant eats much better than a peasant in Kerala in India, and this is known in Asia. 18. While sympathizing with China's problem, one may still react with dismay, perhaps even outrage, to the authoritarian and repressive character of the Chinese state, as one may have varying reactions to the society that is developing. But there is nothing to justify our shameful treatment of China in the post-war years. With all the cynicism of the mid-20th century, it is nevertheless startling to see how easily the rhetoric of imperialism comes to American lips, sometimes muted, sometimes entirely avert. Arthur Schlesinger writes that if our killing machine achieves victory in Vietnam, we may all be saluting the WIS. 267. American power and the inhuman RINS. Dom and statesmanship of the American government. 79. That an American military victory might be a tragedy, this is unthinkable. Roger Hilsman speaks of the Korean War, Dien Bien Phu, the two Laos crises, and Vietnam, as only the opening event of what might well be a century-long struggle for Asia. 80. What kind of struggle it will be is clear, if Laos and Vietnam are precedents. The foreign editor of Look magazine writes, "The Far East is now our Far West." The western frontier of American power today stands on the far side of the Pacific Ocean. It stretches through the island chain off the Asian mainland with 3 toeholds on the continent: Korea, Vietnam and Thailand. We are a Pacific power, the only Pacific power. We are there to stay. This is where we have markets and, except for Japan, no rival producers. 81. These sentiments are familiar. It has been a long-standing belief, expressed by Kodenko, Henry Wallace, Dean Acheson, and many others, that we can escape recurrent economic stagnation or internal regimentation only with ever-expanding markets. These words recall the characteristically direct formulations of Harry Truman, who proclaimed in 1947, in James Warburg's paraphrase, that the whole world should adopt the American system, which could survive in America only if it became a world system. 82. Noting also that unless the trend toward nationalization is reversed, the American way and the way of peace will be threatened. And the natural counterpart to this doctrine is neatly expressed in the 1967 prize essay of the United States Naval Institute by Professor Harold Drude of Claremont College, who argues as follows. The U.S. position in the Pacific is no longer what it was in 1941. The territory which came under direct Japanese attack early in the war, the Hawaiian Islands and the Aleutians, are each soft. The logic of withdrawal. Ian states today, yet Hawaii is closer to Peking than it is to Washington, D.C. The Aleutian Islands at their westernmost tip are closer to China than they are to Seattle, Washington, where once the security of the United States could conveniently, it seemed, rest on Alaska and Hawaii in the Pacific. These two states now have the right to demand the same kind of security which each of them once helped furnish to the continental United States. Consider the implications. Our allies and our bases in Taiwan, Cam Bay, Thailand, also have the right to demand the same kind of security which each of them now helps furnish for Alaska and Hawaii. And so on, indefinitely. Of course, we have heard all of this before. Japan once needed Manchuria for survival. Without Manchuria, it was a potted plant, without roots. And to secure Manchuria, it was obviously necessary to ensure that North China was friendly, and then all of China, and Southeast Asia, and on to the Pacific War. Our claim to special rights in Asia is, on grounds of security or economic interest, far weaker than that of Japan. Japan, however, was dwarfed in wealth and power by a colossus across the sea, and we are not. Along such lines as these, one could develop an instructive sequel to Howard Zion's discussion of Munich, dominance, and containment. What would be the consequences of a withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam? If past events are any guide, the cessation of aggressive military action by the United States will lead to a disengagement of North Vietnamese units, as happened, apparently, during the bombing pause in January 1, 966. It is noteworthy that no group in South Vietnam has advocated North Vietnamese involvement in an immediate political solution, and the same North Vietnamese leadership that was willing, a decade ago, to arrange a modus vivendi with DM 269. Emarai California and Power and the THENU Manda RINS would very likely agree to negotiate the problems of Vietnam with a government that would at least respond to its diplomatic notes. Just what might emerge from the shattered debris of South Vietnamese society, no one can predict with any confidence. It is clear, however, that under the American occupation there can be only an ending tragedy. A few years ago, the Premier of Ceylon commented that the best form of foreign aid the United States can give to small countries is to abstain from interfering in their affairs. As applied to Vietnam, at least, this grim appraisal is no longer an arguable matter. Postscript. Shortly before his death, Bernard Fall told an interviewer the story of a Vietnamese who listened to an American general boasting of one of the latest victories of the Vietnam campaign. "Yes, General, I understand," said the Vietnamese, "but aren't your victories coming closer and closer to Saigon?" 83. The preceding essay was completed in January 1968. Within a week, American victories reached Saigon itself. Several months after, it seems that the Tet Offensive represents a turning point in the war. For the past decade, there have been two versions of the tragedy of Vietnam. The first is that of the war correspondents. Their message has been that Vietnamese resistance is so deeply embedded in the fabric of Vietnamese society that American victory can be achieved only through annihilation. The second is the official story, too familiar to bear repetition. Time after time after time, the correspondence version has been proven correct by events. Now, in the wake of the Tet Offensive, there is only one story. Apart from lonely relics like Joseph Falsock and a few Southeast Asian scholars, everyone now seems to understand that there are only two probable endings to the Vietnam 270. The logic of withdrawal. Tragedy, annihilation or withdrawal of the American Army of Occupation. Annihilation was the prospect foreseen by Bernard Fall in the interview just mentioned. He quotes a captured prisoner who says, "We will all die, but we will not surrender," and he concludes that Vietnam will be destroyed. Spokesmen for the NLF and North Vietnam, however, have long argued that they can win on the battlefield. In the past, their estimates have been realistic. It may be that the Tet Offensive, which brought home to the American public that the official version of the Vietnamese story was an illusion or a lie, may also have persuaded American policy planners that there are no military options remaining, short of drastically changing the nature of the war and taking a long step towards World War III. If so, this raises the prospects, the peace that is, for withdrawal of the American troops. Withdrawal may be called a negotiated settlement. It may be called victory. What is important is not the words but the substance, the return of Vietnam to the Vietnamese. It is conceivable, though unlikely, that the Vietnamese resistance will settle for less. One lesson that has been taught them in the past 20 years is that the only victories that last are military ones. The great powers cannot be trusted. They will resort to treachery and subversion to undermine any diplomatic settlement. It seems unlikely that the NLF will lay down their arms so long as they are able to maintain control of substantial parts of South Vietnam, or that they will accept token representation in a coalition, just as it is unlikely that the French resistance 25 years ago would have terminated its struggle had it been offered the Ministry of Health in the VC government. In the last days of January, some 50,000-60,000 Viet Cong, about 10% North Vietnamese 84 took over most of the urban areas of South Vietnam, obviously with the cooperation. 27.1. AMERI California and Power ANDTHENUMANDARINS of hundreds of thousands of urban residents. The American response was destroy. According to the Associated Press, heavy bombs, aircraft rockets, naval gunfire, napalm, tear gas and all the usual ground weapons from 8-inch howitzers to tank guns are being used in heavily populated city areas. 85 Robert Shakeland reported from Saigon. A dozen separate areas, comprising perhaps 60 or 70 blocks, had been totally burned out. These were almost all residential areas. Most of the damage was the result of rocket attacks by American armed helicopters or other planes, though some of it had been caused by artillery or ground fighting. A more than $10 million textile plant, containing 40,000 spindles, was entirely destroyed by bombs because it was suspected of being a Viet Cong hideout. The correspondent for Le Monde, forced to leave the country soon after, reported that in the popular suburbs, the front has proven that the only way to eliminate its control is through systematic destruction. To dislodge it, the Air Force had to level many residential areas. Fleeing the bombardments, tens of thousands of refugees have poured into the center of the city. 86 Hue was virtually destroyed by American troops, block by block, house by house. According to an American military source, 119 American Marines were killed in this operation, along with 584 North Vietnamese and some 3,000 civilians. 87 Charles Moore reported that in towns such as Hue, Vinh Long, Bang Ta and Mai Tho, appalling destruction was wrought when encircled Allied forces took the decision to destroy the attacking Viet Cong forces by destroying the places they had occupied. 88 The American political scientist Milton Sachs has only this to say in an article on these events, in conventional terms: it now. 272 The logic of withdrawal. Seems clear that the communists have suffered a military defeat in the Tet Offensive. They have expended the lives of thousands of their soldiers without securing a single province or district town of significance. No word from this Southeast Asian expert about the means by which this defeat was accomplished, or its political meaning. 89 American officials on the scene manage a somewhat broader view. One official, quoted by Charles Moore, stated, "The government won the recent battles, but it is important to consider how they won. At first the Viet Cong had won and held everything in some towns except the American military compound and a South Vietnamese position." Senator Mansfield is also aware of the realities. The hamlets, villages and the cities are seen to be honeycombed with a National Liberation Front infrastructure which has undoubtedly existed for many years, which is still intact, and which may well be stronger than ever. There is not the beginning of a stable political situation in South Vietnam. 90 In a broadcast from Saigon, Howard Tuckner of NBC stated that there is no doubt that the U.S. military position in Vietnam has never been weaker. U.S. officers in Saigon now feel for the first time that the United States can lose the war militarily. 91 The military situation is not widely discussed, but it is indicated by a report that more than 1,000 planes and helicopters are reported destroyed or damaged, principally by Russian-built 122mm rockets that have a range of 8 miles or more. According to an unidentified congressman, 1/3 of the U.S. helicopter force in Vietnam has been destroyed or sidelined indefinitely. Losses were almost as heavy in fixed-wing aircraft, particularly in cargo planes. The Navy is reported to have sent a helicopter carrier to the northern part of South Vietnam, in the apparent hope that NLF infiltrators will at least not succeed in penetrating this sanctuary. 92 273 American Power and the new Mandarin. In the Mekong Delta, the major cities suffered heavy damage, virtual destruction in some instances, as the Americans decided, in case after case, to destroy the town in order to save it. In the words of the American major responsible for the victory at Bentra. 93 still, in April, reports from the countryside are complete. However, the general situation is clear from the fact that the IVS has withdrawn most of its field workers because of security conditions. A volunteer reported in February the number of locations at which we can safely place a volunteer have significantly decreased in recent months. Another said that we all knew that security in the countryside was getting worse and worse. 94, according to a South Vietnamese senator, Thong Sang. The government now controls only 1/3 of the country, the remaining 2/3 being occupied by the Viet Cong. 95, the nature of the American war is tersely indicated by an American official. What the Viet Cong did was occupy the hamlets we pacified just for the purpose of having the Allies move in and bomb them out. By their presence, the hamlets were destroyed. 96, the same report indicates that in Binh Dinh province, the Showcase province, for pacification, this had been going on, unreported, for months. The enemy moves in December, which several military men called softening up for the offensive, resulted in a wave of Allied air strikes on villages. Hundreds of homes were destroyed. Newsweek summarizes the situation in detail, quoting an IVS worker who reports from CONFO that almost all of the casualties were caused by United States firepower in the American counterattack. As difficult as this may be to believe, not a single Vietnamese I have met in Saigon nor in the Delta blames the Viet Cong for the events of the past 2 weeks. 97, Halsua Rising. The Tet Offensive led to a significant change in the political. 274. The logic of withdrawal. Situation in the United States. President Johnson has indicated that he will not seek re-election. A number of peace candidates who have yet to discuss fundamental political issues have received substantial support. For the first time, the American government appears willing to take tentative steps towards serious negotiations. It is a devastating indictment of the state of American democracy that only a major military defeat was able to bring about these changes in the political climate. If the past is any guide, only continuing military setbacks in Vietnam and the threat of serious dislocation at home will succeed in moving the government towards concrete steps that might lead to peace. For the first time, there seems a real hope that the war will end without extermination of the Vietnamese. Nevertheless, those who have devoted themselves to working for peace in Vietnam can only be saddened by the realization that they have failed to create the consciousness in this country that we have no right to win a military victory. It is the miraculous heroism of the Vietnamese resistance that has forced these tentative moves towards peace in Vietnam. To say this is not to make a political judgment with regard to the various forces in Vietnamese society, but only to recognize the bare and inescapable facts. For the so-called peace movement, the recent events pose a major challenge. The peace movement has been getting by for too long with cheap jokes about LBJ and with concentration on peripheral issues such as the bombing of North Vietnam. The challenge it now faces is to create the understanding that we have no right to set any conditions at all on a political settlement in Vietnam, that American military force must be withdrawn from Vietnam and from the other simmering Vietnams throughout the world, that American power and resources and technical skills must be used to build and not to repress or to contain or to destroy. 275. America N Power and the NU Manda R INS. N notes. 1. Howardson, Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal, Boston, Beacon Press, 1967. 2. Co-11 Congressional Record, June 1, 1967. 3. quoted in /F. Stone's Weekly, April 3, 1967. 4. William Johnston, United States Policy in Southern Asia, Current History, Volume 46, February 1965, pages 65 to 75. New York Times, May 13th, verse 967. 6. Ibid, May 24, 1967. 7. Christian Science Monitor, May 26, verse 967. 8. Co-11 Congressional Record, April 13th, verse 967, S 5054-7. 9. Ibid, May 3, 1967. 10. Dennis Warner, The Last Confucian, New York, The Macmillan Company, 1963, p. 312. 11. C. Roger Hilsman, To Move a Nation, Garden City, NY, Doubleday and Company, Incorporated, 1967, p. 529. Senator Fulbright, using official Pentagon figures, concluded that the Viet Cong had recruited 160,000 during the course of 1,965 inches. The Truth About Vietnam report on the U.S. Senate hearings of March 1966, San Diego, California, Greenleaf Classics, Incorporated, 1966, p. 320. The witness, General Maxwell Taylor, did not question this conclusion. The figure for 1964 is 45,000,12. Ikayoku Eshige, Youth and Nationalism in Asia, South Vietnam, Japan Quarterly, Volume 14, January to March 1st, 967, pages 38 to 39. 13. Christian Science Monitor, April 24th, verse 967. 14. C. Carl Rowan, in a nationally syndicated column, March 26th, verse 96-7. 15. High official in Washington, explaining a statement to this effect by Ambassador Lodge, New York Times, August 13th, verse 965. 16. John Noakes, New York Times, April 3rd, verse 967. 17. New York Times, April 6, 1967. 18. Shizuo Maruyama, The Other War in Vietnam, The Revolutionary Development Program, Japan Quarterly, Volume 14, July-September 1967, pp. 29, 7303. 19. The Reviews of Jonathan Sills, The Village of Ben Su, New York, Alfred A. Noakes, 1967, have been most remarkable. John. 276. The Logic of Withdrawal. Dillon, in the Christian Science Monitor, December 2nd, 1967, regards the book as sadly incomplete because it does not draw conclusions about the value of these massive and expensive American efforts. He interprets the book as giving a mild criticism of the American and South Vietnamese roles, a conclusion which can only amaze anyone who has read it, until he realizes that Dillon sees nothing to object to in evacuation and total destruction of 4 Viet Cong-controlled villages, including Ben Suc, a thriving village of farmers who were healthy and relatively prosperous. John Mecklin, New York Times Book Review, October 29, 1967, at least realizes that the reader is likely to feel violent disgust as the enormity of Sill's picture begins to sink in, and he has to admit that much of Sill's indictment is justified, accurate and overdue, but he considers it quite unfair, for example, because it fails to mention the monstrous handicaps that plague the United States effort, specifically the lack of command authority over the Saigon regime, a fact which obviously has no relevance to the purely American operation, conducted without informing the Vietnamese, and the deplorably short tour of duty of Americans in Vietnam, making it impossible to acquire the kind of experience so badly needed in situations such as Ben Suc. He thinks, nevertheless, that the book should be required reading in the Pentagon, because of its pinpointing of critical areas where the United States could be doing a better job in Vietnam, presumably, in conducting such operations even more efficiently in the future. These reactions testify to a kind of creeping itch-manism, which in fact must also explain the limited reaction to the original New York Times report of the Ben Su operation, January 1, 1967. Pacification in Ben Su had been a total failure, so the only military or political solution to this place, according to the American colonel in charge, was forced resettlement. Of course, some of the villagers weren't too happy about it. I imagine there will be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth, but they'll do what they're told, said the colonel. Some might not do what they were told, of course. 41 villagers did not. During the day they were tracked down and killed. The conclusion? Soon the government will have no need to win the hearts and minds of Ben Suc. There will be no Ben Suc. One can hardly decide which is more scandalous, the events themselves or the muted response. 277. AMERIC and POWERANLTHENUMANDARINS. Mecklin, incidentally, is responsible for some of the most amazing comments on Vietnam. In a review in the New York Times Book Review, June 4, 1967, he attributes to Thich Nhat Hanh the idiotic proposal that both the Americans and the communists go away and allow the Vietnamese to work things out. As senior officer in the United States mission in Saigon from 1962 to 1964, he might, one would think, have perceived that the Viet Cong were Vietnamese, particularly since United States officials in Saigon at the end of 1962 estimated that about one half of the South Vietnamese support the NLF. Robert Sigli Arnhem, South Vietnam, Nation and Distress, Bolton, put in the Phle Lan Company, 1963 p. 145. In his mission in Torment, Garden City, NY, Doubleday and Company, Incorporated, 1965. Mecklin describes the Vietnamese peasant as a man whose vocabulary is limited to a few hundred words, whose power of reason develops only slightly beyond the level of an American 6-year-old, whose mind is untrained and therefore atrophies. P. 76. But strangely, the political and military tactics of the Viet Cong, making use of techniques that were skillfully entwined in the life and character of the Vietnamese peasant, confounded not only the U.S. mission but also the aristocratic leaders of the Diem regime. Pages 78 to 79. Their forces were developed to a surprisingly sophisticated degree, with jungle arms factories, radio nets, clandestine hospitals, propaganda printing presses, VC cameramen filming the action in ambushes. P. 79. To the government forces, the Viet Cong seemed to be 8 feet tall, and so on. For further information on the achievements of these atrophied minds, see Malcolm Brown, The New Face of War, Indianapolis, The Bob's Merry-Go, Incorporated, 1965. 20. Kyoza Mori, The Logic and Psychology of North Vietnam, Japan Q11 Nathalie, Volume 14, July to September 1967, pages 286 to 96. According to Bernard Fall, it was the hapless refugees, fleeing, for the most part, from aerial and artillery bombardment, who account for the whole 5% of the population said to have come under government control in 1966. see his last reflections on a walled garden city. NY, Doubleday and Company, Incorporated, 1967, p. 157. By such means we increase our control over the population of South Vietnam. To 1. R. W. Apple, New York Times, July 22, 1967. 22. Christian Science Monitor, July 8, verse 967. 23. See the leader story in Christian Science Monitor, September 20th, verse 967, for an attempt to sort out what happened behind the scenes. 278. The logic of withdrawal. 24. For a careful analysis of the elections by an American Southeast Asian expert who has specialized in problems of electoral politics, see Dr. David Werfel reports on Vietnam, Methodist Division of Peace and World Order, 100 Maryland Avenue North. E. Washington, D.C., September 21, 1967. 25. New York Times, September 23rd, verse 967. 26. Christian Science Monitor, December 2nd 196 7. 27. Cited in the New Republic, January 6th, verse 968, p. 29, from an interview with Henry Brandon of the London Sunday Times. 28. New York Times, December 1st date, 1967. 29. See the Christian Science Monitor, December 1st date, 1967, for many details. 30. New York Times, December 28, verse 967. 3-1. Congressional Record, August 24, verse 965, S20654. 32. New York Times, December 8, verse 967. 33. Ibid, December 6, verse 967. 34. Christian Science Monitor, January 1st 1967. 67, pages 507 to 14. He adds the obscure remark that if this independent South Vietnam were viable, strong, popular, enlightened, and effective, then foreign and diplomatic repercussions of two Vietnams de facto would be easier to handle, particularly for regulating the relations between North and South Vietnam and future consultations and elections which we in Washington envisaged coming at some time, perhaps in 1956 or possibly a little later. At the Geneva Agreements that we were pledged to uphold say nothing about two Vietnams de facto, nor about an independent South Vietnam as a strong, viable state. Obviously, it is absurd to speak of a viable, independent state bounded by a provisional demarcation line, which should not in any way be interpreted as constituting a political or territorial boundary. It is interesting, incidentally, that Mr. Young can summarize the American effort to promote political viability in Vietnam from 1954 to 1967 with not a mention of what happened to those elections that were envisaged coming in 1956 or possibly a little later. Richard Falk has commented on the hypocrisy of the accusation that North Vietnam challenged world order by its indirectors. 280. The logic of withdrawal. Saigon in South Vietnam in the 1960s, noting that in Vietnam Saigon's establishment, rather than the subsequent attempt at its removal of a political frontier at the 17th parallel represented the coercive challenge to world order, since the political settlement at Geneva in 1954 provided a formula for the nullification, rather than one for the maintenance, of the division, international law and the United States' role in Vietnam. Yale's Law Journal, Volume 76, May 1, 967. p. 1118. Similarly, the United States' effort to build up the military strength of the Saigon regime, which enabled it to crush domestic opposition and institute the grim dictatorship that supporters of the American effort were later to deplore, was a clear violation of our pledge at Geneva not to use force or threat of force to disturb the accord. Secretary Dulles was as candid as Kenneth Young about our intention to disregard the Geneva Agreements, announcing our intention to build up the truly independent states of Cambodia, Laos and Southern Vietnam. Department of State Bulletin, August 2nd, 1954. Cited Diane George M. Carvin and John W. Lewis, United States and Vietnam, New York. The Dial Press, 1967, p. 61. It is, incidentally, remarkable that our professed dissatisfaction with the accords and announced intention not to observe them is often cited today as somehow relieving us from the obligation to honor them, as eliminating any onus for this violation. 45. Cited in R. Sigliano, of Cit. p. 196. From Philippe Devlers and Jean Lakejer, La Fente-Guerre, Indochina, 1954, Paris, Dations du Sil, 1960. 46. Vietnam, The Agonizing Reappraisal, Current History, Volume 48, February 1st, 965, pages 95 to 102. In his The Two Vietnams, Rev. ed. New York, Frederick A. Brager, Incorporated, 1964. Paulusits, p. 402, that the infiltration of guerrilla teams to the north has been repeatedly attempted over the past years and has met with dismal failure. Present losses are estimated to run at 85% of the total personnel engaged in such operations. This despite the air of massive tranquility that he himself observed in a visit to North Vietnam in the fall of 1962, when these operations were in progress. No guards in watchtower, no airplane patrols. The Hanoi police don't even carry pistols. Saturday Evening Post, November 24, 1st 962, pp. 1821, cf. The recent eyewitness accounts by David Cerngrun and others, noting the same phenomenon, which Fall characterizes as one of the most ominous things about North Vietnam. 28.1. American Power and the Enumanda RINF. 47. Richard Goodwin, Triumph or Tragedy, New York. Vintage Books, 1966, p. 26. There are many other such reports. To mention a recent one, Louis Heron writes in the London Times, April 20th, 1st 968, from Washington, that the CIA did in fact deploy saboteurs in the north from 1959. They were parachuted in or dropped off the coast by patrol boats, and Vice President Key commanded the Air Transport Wing of the South Vietnam Air Force in 1962 and 1963. He is known to have been in charge of the parachute drops. The agents were South Vietnamese and were trained by the CIA in Special Forces camps, notably the 7th Special Forces Group. The frogmen were trained at Dien Nan. Apart from destroying bridges and other vulnerable points, they were also expected to organize guerrilla warfare, especially in the Catholic areas. Both operations were a complete fiasco. 95% casualties were admitted in 1963, but the opium trade flourished. Heron's report goes on to discuss the possible connection between these operations and the opium trade, and the report's under investigation by Senate subcommittee that Marshal Key was dismissed from the operation for his participation in opium smuggling. 48. Dean Worth, December 5th, verse 966. Cited in Theodore Draper, Abuse of Power, New York. The Viking Press, Incorporated, 1967, p. 45. It is difficult to exaggerate the startling character of the material Draper has assembled, particularly with respect to the pronouncements of Dean Rusk. 49. New York Times, June 7, first 965. Polls taken for CBS in November 1st 966 and February 1st 96-7 indicate that even among strong anti-communist South Vietnamese, exposed primarily to government propaganda, there still appears to be a rejection of the American idea that the war is a consequence of aggression from the North. Richard Fuld, International Law and the United States Role in Vietnam, p. 102n. The results are reported in the Times, March 22, 1967. Even in this biased sample of South Vietnamese opinion, 83% were in favor of, and 5% opposed to, reunification with the North after the end of the war. An emphasis on negotiations was preferred to extend science of military operations to the North by a ratio of 4-1. The Polo F. Viet Cong prisoners cited above showed that few of them considered themselves communists or could give a definition of communism, and confirmed the judgments of most observers that the Viet Cong functioned far more through persuasion and indoctrination. 82. The logic of withdrawal than through the authoritarianism of traditional armies. It has often been emphasized, even by those committed to the American effort in Vietnam, that it would be a serious mistake to consider communist power in South Vietnam as based predominantly on terrorism, military strength, or even upon the indifference of an ignorant peasantry. Sigli Arno, of Sit. p. 158. There is near unanimity outside of the State Department that the historical fact is that force in the struggle for the South was first used by the Diem regime, not by the communists. That the latter was, moreover, far more restrained, that although guidance and assistance from the North may have been an important factor in the amazing success of the NLF, it would have made little headway without wide popular support, and that the war started as a civil war in the South, well before the alleged infiltration began. Joseph Buttinger, Vietnam, a Dragon M battled, New York. Frederick A. Prager, Incorporated 1967, Volume 2, pp. 976f, 981-82. Buttinger's study is quite interesting, not only for its careful and extensive scholarship, but also because he was, for many years, a strong supporter of the Diem regime and the American involvement in support of it. He explains, for example, why Diem was unable to move towards democratic, representative structures. Local elections would have given the Viet Minh control of most of the rural communities. The Viet Minh was not only popular and ineffective political control of large regions, but it alone had people with the requisite organizational skills to exploit whatever opportunities for democratic self-expression the regime opened up. Thus, freely constituted organizations too would have been captured by the Viet Minh. p. 856. He adds that the NLF was truly the Viet Minh reborn, and speaks of the similarity, or better, near identity, of the Viet Minh and the NLF. He also analyzes the much greater economic progress in the North, cf. 928, 966f, and notes that repression of dissidents in the North was just severe than in the South, largely, he field, because dissidence was less dangerous, cf. p. 964f. 50. The thrust OF much OF the American effort in Vietnam, according to Sigli Arno, who served in the Michigan State University Advisory Group in Vietnam, Sit. 1963, p. 197. In contrast, precious little of American energies or resources had been devoted to political goals, as contrasted with the military and economic gains. His detailed breakdown of aid figures shows that military aid was overwhelmingly dominant, even 28A. AMER Icon Power AND the NUMANDARINS. In economic and social development, and that even true economic aid was largely directed to the relatively affluent. CPP 135F. For his summary. 5-1. Saville Davis, Christian Science Monitor, October 2nd 1967. 52. Not a dove, but no longer a hawk. New York Times Magazine, October 9th, verse 966. 53. As to the military, Jonathan Randall points out in the New York Times, June 1st 1967, that only one officer above the rank of lieutenant colonel did not serve in the French army against the Viet Minh in the French Indochina War. Perhaps this is part of the reason why the ARVN army has little interest in the war, while the Viet Cong can take the same unwilling recruit and turn him into a tiger in 6 months. American regimental advisor, as it may go part way towards explaining the desertion rates that Randall cites for the elite battalions in 1966, 22% for the armed forces as a whole, 31% for the Rangers, 33% for the Marines, and 45% for the Airborne Battalion. 54. See Halberstam, Sit, for some indication of the incredible corruption of those to whom he refers as our Vietnamese. Their cynicism has continually scandalized American reporters. Malcolm Bro '1.11e, for example, reports that Vietnamese military officers have ordered hamlets blown off the map by American sky raiders to cover cases of graft. Sit, p. 210. 55. Cohen, Sit. See Note 8. Reports that the medical staff of Hue Hospital estimated that almost 90% of the war casualties were assailed by American and South Vietnamese Army air bombardments and artillery, and that an American working at King Nai Hospital estimated that about 70% of all civilian war casualties had been inflicted by American, South Korean and South Vietnamese aerial bombardment and artillery. Note that these estimates refer to areas more or less under American control, where victims can hope to reach the hospitals. What is amazing is that any substantial number of casualties in such areas are caused by American and Allied forces. Even in Saigon Hospital, Cohen saw many victims of napalm, mostly children. He was informed by medical students that it is government policy to disperse as widely as possible napalm casualties that are brought to hospitals so that visitors will not conclude that there are so many of them. American reactions to such discoveries are often astonishing. For example, Senator Proxmire inserted into the Congressional Record, May 284. The Logic of Withdrawal. 26, 1965, S. 11700 and 1981. A Whitewash of Administration Policy by Thomas Ross in the Chicago Sun-Times, May 23, 1965, to show how real experts support the government. Support the government he does. He also points out that the Viet Cong have achieved a high degree of immunity and move freely throughout most of the country with little fear that the local populace will betray them to the government. Military strategy has therefore been forced to shift from counterinsurgency to classical war. But, he observes, it is still much too soon to tell whether sophisticated weapons and conventional ground troops can succeed where counterinsurgency has failed. In fact, there is some evidence of popular resentment to the expanding use of napalm, a development which is not surprising if one has observed a hospital ward full of bleeding women and children seared from head to toe. While Mr. Ross and Senator Proxmire may await the evidence, others will draw their own conclusions, even before the inevitable study by the Rand Corporation. 56. Excerpts from his secret testimony appear in the New York Times, February 2nd, verse 968. The Viet Cong will be happy to learn, from his testimony, that we do not seek the surrender of Viet Cong forces. We would be content to see them lay down their arms and take their place as peaceful citizens of South Vietnam, or move to the north if they so desire. Presumably, the distinction between surrendering and laying down one's arms is explained in the censored part of the testimony. The remark recalls that of another leading Dove, Arthur Goldberg, who announced our position before the United Nations, in what was widely described as a conciliatory statement, as being, no military forces, armed personnel or bases, are to be maintained in North or South Vietnam except those under the control of the respective governments. New York Times, September 22nd, verse 967. The Viet Cong, in other words, need not surrender. We ask only that it go out of existence as a military force. And when the government we have instituted establishes total military control, we will have no further interest in retaining our army in Vietnam. The German High Command could have outlined its goals in France in just the same terms. 5-7. Lyndon B. Johnson, Congressional Record, March 1, 1948, House, p. 2883. 58. Marcel Niedergang in Le Monde Hebdomadaire, January 1, 824, 1968. The same speech was cited by Hugh O'Shaughnessy in The New Statesman, December 1, 1967, who goes on to say that similar things. 285. American Power and the New Manda RINF are happening in Nicaragua, which is virtually a U.S. colony and where guerrilla warfare broke out this year. In The Nation, February 5th, verse 968, pp. 166-67, Norman Diamond reports on the application in Guatemala of advanced techniques in counterinsurgency being developed in Vietnam, including heavy bombing in large areas of the country, pacification, even rerouting of rivers to cover the traces of bombings and massacres, as well as razing forests and bulldozing villages, all under the paternalistic guidance of the American advisors. The American press has yet to cover these events. In general, the failure of the press to report events in Latin America is scandalous. The coverage of Latin American events in Le Monde is greater in scope, and incomparably greater in depth, than anything to be found in the American press, which, like American scholarship, is little concerned with American-directed violence in other countries so long as it is reasonably successful. The quoted statement of the Guatemalan vice president would very likely cause something of a commotion in liberal circles were it to be published in the American press. However, hardly an eyebrow would be raised at other parts of Niedergang's report. For example, these lines, according to M. Antonio Palacios, of the Bank of Guatemala, 2/3 of the population live in a primitive manner. The infant mortality rate is frightful. 70% of those under 20 have never been to school. The average life expectancy is scarcely more than 40 years. Hunger and
looks like we've come to the end. So wow. Let me, yeah, so. Alright, that was awesome. So we'll see you next time. Take care.